Hey Renee, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm just gonna wait maybe a minute or two longer, and then we'll get started.
Sounds good to me.
Give me a thumbs up if you can see the slide. Thank you. All right, well, it's a couple minutes after 12, and I think we'll get started. My name is Mark Weicker. I'm with Albite Weicker, and this is the Special Education Legal Clinic. We are in the, I guess, the seventh or eighth workshop in a series that we're holding. This is a collaboration between Disability Rights Ohio and OCECD and Albite Weicker. And our presentation today will be presented by me, and the title is School Choice for Special Education Parents. We talk about some options for attendance at different types of schools today. A couple just administrative things before we get started. The registration link you'll see there at the bottom of the slide, lawyersforstudents.com/legal clinic. That's where you signed up for today's workshop. We have two more in the series. We have procedural rights and dispute resolution next month on June 19th. And then the last one in the series on July 17th is the new parent notice requirements, which will be presented by Tammy Sebastian at OCECD. We are just finalizing a new series that we're going to start, a new series of workshops in September. So we're going to take August off, let everyone get back to school, and then start in September. We're going to keep the third Mondays of the month that seems to work out pretty well. So September 18th will be the first workshop, and that'll go on for 8 months. And we're going to focus the entire series on transition, post-secondary transition, including education, independent living, and employment. So you can sign up for that at the same link again, back at lawyersforstudents.com/legal clinic. I spoke too soon though, because we don't have the new series up there. So it'll probably be within the next week or two. We'll have the new series posted, and then you'll be able to register for those new workshops. You can register now for the workshop in June and the workshop in July. Another couple things that exist at the same page where you register, we have resources for special education parents and educators there that we've put together. The 3 organizations involved with the legal clinic have put those together. And then we have sample letters, sample notices, and then a research database that we put together for parents and educators is also available at the same page. One other thing is we do have a Q&A available if you want to drop questions in the box. It's only myself doing the presentation. Renee may be able to help me out if questions pop up, and I'll try to answer those as they come. But we'll also have a little bit of time at the end to answer questions related to the presentation, or if you have some general questions about special education, we can try to get to those too. Just depends on how many we have through the workshop and how much time we have left at the end. But by all means, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A, and we can either answer those live, or Renee can type a response if she can. Okay, well, let's get started. This is kind of a fun workshop. We every once in a while we like to kind of take a step back and look at the whole I guess all of the options available to special education parents in terms of education, because oftentimes we get a little bit focused on, traditional public schools, if that's the setting we're in, and we forget about some of the options that might be available through other avenues, whether that be in school or homeschool or through the scholarships, all of which we'll talk about, charter schools or private schools. So this is a nice little flyover of all the available options for special education parents. And we do include a lot of information in one small workshop, but I try to touch on the main points. We're in a position where we get a lot of questions, or I guess we field a lot of questions about situations that arise in each of the settings: public schools, career technical schools, community schools, private schools. So we see some of the pitfalls as well as some of the benefits of each of the different settings for special education students. So that I've tried to highlight some of that. It's discipline, transportation is typically an issue. And some of those things, the cost, of course, is an issue. We'll try to touch upon with each of the options that we present here today. Here's an overview. So we'll talk about the options themselves, like I've mentioned a few times, the different types of schools, and then the benefits and limitations for special education students in each of those settings. And then we'll talk a little bit about how those schools are funded, or if you have to pay for them, whether they're taxpayer funded, whether you'd be responsible for private tuition if you chose that option. And then we'll talk about how to pay for those in addition with the use of scholarships. So the EdChoice Scholarship is one we'll talk about, and then the John Peterson or the Autism Scholarship are 2 others that can help fund placement at a private school or to receive special education related services. So here again are the big categories of types of schools. Most of you are probably aware. We have traditional public schools in which you would attend your school district of residence. We have alternative schools, which are kind of a subset of traditional public schools. We'll talk a little bit about those. Career and tech schools also very closely affiliated with traditional public schools, but with a focus on career and technical education, serving typically high school students grades 11 and 12, but you'll see that's expanded recently. And then charter schools the term charter schools is kind of used nationwide, but in Ohio they call them community schools. So we'll talk about the difference between traditional public schools and charter schools, and the difference between charter schools and private schools, also known as non-public schools in Ohio. And then we'll touch on homeschooling, which is really just an exception to the attendance requirement at traditional public schools. So this is traditional public schools are, of course, what you think of when you think about going to school. This is the school district of residence. You reside in a district, you pay taxes in that district. And so long as a student resides in the district, they have a right to attend school at that public school district. And they have a right to be assigned to the nearest, well, I shouldn't say the nearest. They have a right to be assigned to the building in which the district has come up with a plan on which and where students should be assigned. Typically, it would be the closest, but not always. Special education students have a right to attend the school district they would be assigned even without the disability. We can talk a little bit more about that, but sometimes schools, traditional public schools, will have maybe one elementary school where they serve students who need behavior interventions. And although that is possible, there is the right of the student with special education needs to attend a school district and be placed in the least restrictive environment. So if that student can be served in the student's assigned building, they should be served in the assigned building. And sometimes the school districts will say services aren't available at those assigned buildings. And that is always up for, I guess, debate in terms of whether it's just a lack of resources or whether or not the student would be required to be reassigned so that they can get the interventions they need. Typically, the position of a student advocate is that the student should be able to attend in the least restrictive environment in the school district in which they would be assigned without the disability. But let me back up a step and talk a little bit more about just traditional public schools. These are bricks and mortar schools. Most traditional public schools, there used to be a lot more of them, but most of them now have what's called an alternative school. So this is a a school, or sometimes it's a classroom operated by the district. So it could be for behavior interventions. It could be the students are assigned there because of disciplinary reasons, as an alternative, let's say, to suspension or expulsion. But alternative schools are generally operated by the school district of residence. However, more and more are now operated by either, let's say, the Board of DD, like a third party, or the Educational Service Center. That can happen too, in which case it really is just an outside placement by the district as opposed to a reassignment to an alternative school. But generally speaking, when we talk about alternative schools, those are schools operated by the school district of residence. Now, I added online academies here since the last time I did this presentation, because now with COVID, one of the, I guess, benefits that we've realized coming out of COVID is that now most traditional public schools have an online academy, which is an option or an alternative for students attending that district. Prior to COVID, I'd say 90% of the online schools were operated by community schools, which we'll talk about. But now most traditional public schools have an online school because they were, not necessarily required, but they were forced to create an online school during COVID, and so that students could receive the information or receive the curriculum online. So now most schools continue to operate those for students who prefer the online school, students who have been disciplined, and that's an alternative setting as opposed to suspension, expulsion, or for students who can't attend school because of a disability for one reason or another, either in the short term or the long term. An online academy can be a good option, and you technically stay enrolled in the school district of residence through the school's online academy. A lot of traditional public schools also operate STEM or magnet schools, science, technology, engineering, and math schools. or magnet schools in which there's some type of lottery to attend for students who are qualified. Everyone probably knows that the cost of traditional public schools is tuition free if you're attending, or if you're within the district in which the student resides. Open enrollment is an option too. We don't include a slide about this, but some adjacent districts will offer open enrollment, or I should say they offer open enrollment to students residing in adjacent districts. That's an option for schools. It's not a requirement. If you attend through open enrollment, the obligations largely, the special education obligations largely shift to the school district you end up attending. Even though you don't reside in that district, if open enrollment is an option, you can fully enroll, and you should receive special education services in accordance with the student's IEP from the district that you are attending. So transportation, the rule regarding transportation is if a student lives farther than 2 miles away and they're a K-8 student, the school district, public school district, has to provide transportation. Sometimes they provide it for all students, but they don't have to. They just have to provide it K-8 for students living more than 2 miles away. Some districts are small enough, Grandview, for instance, or Bexley, for instance, if we're talking about Central Ohio, that they don't have any students living more than 2 miles away, so they don't have busing. And we'll talk a little bit more about transportation to private schools or community schools, which is also typically provided by the school district of residence. Now, and I should back up one step too and say transportation, if it's listed on the IEP as a necessary service for the student to be able to access the education, then it, regardless of the distance or the age of the student, that student should receive transportation to the public school district or the private school district, regardless of distance or age. Discipline, this is where, again, we get calls from parents of students with disabilities, and a lot of times that's the trigger for us to be involved, is a disciplinary incident. The benefit of going to a traditional public school is that the law requires due process. So that's, if you're going to be suspended or expelled, then you have a right to a hearing, you have a right to tell your side of the story, you have a right to, present witnesses and evidence. That is all statutory, which means it's codified in the law, and public schools in Ohio have to do that. It's not true for all schools. We'll talk about that. Now, a major component for special education parents too is the MDR. So the manifestation determination review, or the MDR hearing, is a hearing in which, if the student is subject to more than 10 days removal from school, 10 consecutive days, I should say, or if they're non-consecutive and the discipline is based on the same incident or incidents, so it's the behavior repeating itself, then students who have an IEP or students on a 504 plan are entitled to an MDR hearing, in which they determine whether the conduct in question was a manifestation of the student's disability. So that's important, because you'd imagine lots of times the conduct in question is a manifestation of ADHD or autism or ODD or whatever the disability happens to be. You can imagine that, more likely than not, the behavior may have been a manifestation. So it's an important procedural protection for special education students and parents that before they ever suspend or expel beyond 10 days, that they provide this manifestation determination review hearing. And if they determine that it was a manifestation of the disability, then the discipline cannot be imposed, which again is important. And if the discipline is imposed, you still have the due process procedure to follow, to argue, present witnesses and evidence, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine how important the due process and the MDR are to the disciplinary process for a special education student. Now, the impact on special education in regards to attending a traditional public school, as you probably know, public schools are funded partially by federal funds, which makes them subject to IDEA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the state operating standards for students with disabilities, public records laws, and FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which is the right to receive a copy of your child's education record and a right to protect that record from third parties. Though the fact that they're traditional public schools are bound by those, it's very important. Obviously, all the protections that come under IDEA, which is, to request mediation, file a state complaint or a due process complaint, to challenge that the fact that the IEP is not being serviced correctly. All of those things are a result of the traditional public school accepting federal funds to educate children with disabilities. In regards to FERPA, you may not think that's an important or impactful obligation on the part of the school, but just imagine if you did not have a right to your child's education record, or there was no affirmative federal obligation for the school to provide that record. You can imagine that information that you wanted to receive, let's say special education records, incident reports, grades, progress reports, all of those things you would not have access to unless FERPA, the federal student privacy statute, applied. So you can imagine how protective that is of student rights. So the traditional public schools are responsible for finding the children with disabilities. You may have referred to that or heard of that referred to as child find. They're obligated to evaluate children with suspected disabilities, create an IEP if they're qualified, and then to service the IEP if the student is attending the traditional public school district. I mentioned that children are required to attend their school district of residence, and the schools are required to enroll them. If not, the student could be truant, and obviously the school itself would run afoul of state law if they didn't allow a child who resided in the district to attend. The only exception, the very only exception to enrollment and attendance in a public school district is if the child is suspended or expelled, or the child is placed in a private school or a separate setting or a service provider outside the school district. So otherwise, the child has to attend or they'll be truant, and otherwise the school district has to allow the child to attend. And that, like I mentioned, with the traditional public schools, you have access to dispute resolution through the Department of Education. That means if you need a facilitator at your IEP meeting, they'll send one. If you want to request mediation, you can do that. As long as your student has an IEP, the Department of Education will provide a mediator. You can schedule a mediation and work through some issues with the school district. Very important dispute resolution option. And then, of course, you can file a state written complaint, or you can file a due process complaint, and everything in between with the traditional public school districts. Important protections for special education students. All right, career and technical schools. Now, more and more career and technical schools are becoming relevant to students with disabilities in Ohio. The schools, I would say 20 years ago, were seen as workforce development schools, but that's changed a lot. There's been a lot of funding added to career and tech schools, and there's been a lot of focus on transition to employment, transition to adulthood, transition to independent living through career and technical schools. They're pretty well geared to provide those transition related services. And of course, transition related services are especially important for students with disabilities to transition them to adulthood so that they can complete the K-12 education effectively and move on to whatever it is they're going to move on to. So now, even though career and technical schools still largely only serve grades 11 and 12, there are courses that are offered very early as middle school. And programs in construction, technology, transportation, as you see the list there, manufacturing, IT, business, marketing, hospitality, human services, arts, law, and education. And the way the career and tech schools work is they are public schools that serve several school districts surrounding the career and tech school. And typically the boards of the career and tech schools are made up of representatives from each of the school districts they serve. And again, cost is tuition free if you're attending the local career technical school. And transportation would be provided by the public school district typically, or sometimes the CTE. Same thing, these are public schools, so discipline, it does entitle the student to due process in an MDR hearing if the student was subject to more than 10 days consecutive out of school. Special education. CTE schools are public schools bound by all the same laws. They must service students with disabilities in accordance with the IEP that was developed by the school district of residence. So if there are accommodations on the IEP, if there are services, including aid services or individual instruction, if that's not provided through the school district of residence, that has to be provided through the CTE school. So most of the time, there's a kind of a joint enrollment. You're always jointly enrolled with the public school district of residence and a CTE, but sometimes the student would spend half of the day at the CTE and half the day at the public school district of residence, and typically the student would get small group instruction and those types of things at the school district of residence, but that doesn't, there's no waiver of obligations by the CTE. So if the child's entitled to an aid, that has to be provided at the CTE. If the child's entitled to accommodations in the classroom, that has to be provided by the CTE. And just a few years ago, there was this consensus among CTE schools in Ohio to provide FAPE in the schools. And there's been a little bit of a focus on making sure that students have access to a free and appropriate publication in the CTE schools. And you still have access to dispute resolution through the Department of Education. And like I mentioned, the school district of residence retains responsibility for the IEP development and the implementation if the student is duly enrolled. Okay, so now we move on to public charter schools. These are known in Ohio as community schools. Nationwide, again, most people refer to them as charter schools. They are public schools, which is a surprise to some people. They're bound by most of the same laws that traditional public schools are bound by. In the special education context, absolutely, they're bound by the same rules that traditional public schools are bound by. But they are less regulated than traditional public schools. And in Ohio, again, they're called community schools. And community schools, they can be a bricks and mortar school. So there's just a few around here: Early College Academy, Fitness Academy. Typically, there's some focus. Arts and College Preparatory Academy. So some focus on the arts, some focus on a particular topic. There are STEM-related community schools, and these are made up of the bricks and mortar schools and online schools. So Ohio Virtual Academy is a big online school, and there are a few other big ones, which the online schools, the online community schools typically accept students statewide, so it doesn't matter where you reside. The community schools, which are brick and mortar schools, a lot of times are limited to the county or limited to the surrounding school districts in which the community school exists. This is an alternative to the public school district of residence. So if you send your child to an online school, which is not the traditional public schools online school, if you send them to an online charter school, then that, for all intents and purposes, the student has been unenrolled from the traditional public school and re-enrolled in the community school. And that's true for a bricks and mortar school too. Like I mentioned, they're subject to less regulation than traditional public schools. Then the cost of a community school is free. That's the number one indicator between a public charter school or a community school and a private school, is that tuition is free at a community school in Ohio. And that's because the per pupil funding that the traditional public school receives is redirected to the charter school when you enroll there. So even though the charter school doesn't get your real estate tax dollars if you own property in the district, they do get this per pupil funding from the State Department of Education, which as soon as your traditional public school district of residence notifies the Department of Education that you've transferred to the community school then receives those dollars. There's actually kind of a count week that I think they work by. In October, they do a count, and then they may do a count in the springtime to count the number of students attending the community school, and then those funds are redirected to the community school. So that's how they're funding. Typically no tuition at all that you would be responsible for as a parent at a community school or charter school. Another surprise to a lot of parents is that transportation must be provided by the public school district of residence if the community school is 30 minutes or less in travel time away from the public school building where the student would be assigned. So if the community school is within 30 minutes away, then the public school district of residence must provide transportation, so long as it provides transportation to those same students in its district. Remember, they're required to provide transportation to K-8 students who live more than 2 miles away. If they provide transportation to K-12 students who live more than 2 miles away, then they'd be required to transport that student attending a community school on the same basis. There still is the 2-mile requirement. So if a student lives within 2 miles of the community school in which they attend, then the public school district of residence would not be required to provide transportation in that case. Important to note that due process and an MDR are required in community schools. It is a public school, partially receives federal funds, so they are bound by IDEA, which requires the MDR, and they are bound by the state law, which requires due process for suspension and expulsion. So the special education impact. So same thing with the traditional public school. Since public charter schools are public, they are subject to IDEA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, operating standards, public records law, and FERPA. And they must service students with disabilities in accordance with the IEP. This is true even with an online school. Now, an online school is an online curriculum. So the service of an IEP may look very different, and it may be a challenge to receive the services in the same way that you did in the traditional public school or any other bricks and mortar school, because the student is attending online. And there is not an obligation in all cases, in some cases there are, not an obligation by an online school to provide services in person to a student with disability. So you have to think long and hard about whether or not, even if the online school is a better delivery option for the curriculum, you have to think about the services the student receives on an IEP and whether or not they can be effectively delivered remotely or in some other way from the online school before you transfer a student with a disability to an online school. You do have access to dispute resolution through the Department of Education when you're attending a community school, and the obligations mostly shift from the traditional school to the community school, except for the traditional public school is still responsible for finding children with disabilities that reside in their district and creation of the IEP initially. Okay. So private, or also known as non-public schools, if it wasn't confusing enough. So non-public schools in Ohio, they consist of religious schools, non-religious schools. They consist of chartered schools and non-chartered schools. Well, that's confusing. If I back up a slide, public charter schools are known as community schools, and private schools are known as chartered or non-chartered. So I would, as a parent, the chartered piece doesn't mean a lot. What chartered means for a private school is that school has been approved by the Ohio Department of Education to be a private school. So that gives them access to certain things, funds, scholarships, that they wouldn't otherwise have. So you can be, of course, a private religious chartered school. You can be a non-religious chartered school. So that would be one, of course, the private religious schools would be St. Charles, Watterson. A good example of a non-religious school, I think, would be Columbus School for Girls. Columbus Academy, maybe. Those are non-religious private schools. All of those I've mentioned so far are chartered. And there are a few non-chartered schools, but I actually don't have an example of one offhand. But charter just means they agree to abide by the Ohio operating standards in regards to the operation of a K-12 school. And they've been approved to do that. There are also private schools that exist specifically to serve students with disabilities. These are schools who believe they can do it better than the public school. Maybe they provide additional resources or additional staff. They have a lower staff to student ratio. You're probably familiar with some of these. Bridgeway Academy is one, Marburn Academy is another. Lots of them exist across the state in which they serve students with disabilities in particular. Now, they still are a private school, and I want you to keep that in mind. They may do a better job of serving a student with a disability because of their the way they operate, because of the techniques they use, because of the staff they have on board, because of the number of staff they have on board, because of the training they receive. It absolutely, some of these schools can do it better, specifically for students who need certain interventions. However, they're still private schools, and that I'm going to get to that in a second. So the cost of a private school is you pay tuition, number one. It's a private school, you pay tuition. That's how to distinguish it from a public, either chartered school, I should say community school, or a public school district of residence. You're responsible for tuition unless you have a scholarship, number one. We'll talk about the John Peterson Scholarship and the Autism Scholarship and the Ed Choice Scholarship, all of which are available to help you cover the cost of tuition in a chartered non-public school. Another exception to that is sometimes the school district of residence will recognize they're not equipped to service the student with a disability for one reason or another. And the school can place that student in a private school that services that student's disability in particular, or is better equipped to service that student's disability. In that case, the district, because the student is district placed, pays for the child's education, and the district remains responsible for the development of the student's IEP. Well, initially identifying the student with the disability, developing the IEP, but if they're district placed, they're responsible for paying the tuition in that private school. That happens because, again, the school district of residence is responsible for providing a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And maybe the least restrictive environment, although it's on one end of the spectrum, the more restrictive end of the spectrum, is that the student is placed in another school, a private school, or some other placement, so that the students' needs can be met. Transportation. So this is, again, provided by the public school in the same way that it would be provided to a community school if the private school is 30 minutes or less in travel time from the public school building where the student would have been assigned. Same rules apply. Now, here's a big difference. There's no due process or MDR required in a private school. Private schools mostly don't accept federal funding. Some of them do, which would obligate them under ADA, but it would not obligate them under IDEA, typically. And private schools make their own rules when it comes to discipline. This is a real shocker sometimes, because Johnny gets expelled, he's got a disability. The school was aware of the disability. They may even have what they call an IEP or a service plan at the private school, which they were working to service. But the student gets suspended or expelled for more than 10 consecutive days. And lo and behold, there's no hearing required because the handbook, the school's handbook doesn't require a hearing. They say we can expel for any reason or no reason. And especially at a private religious school, if it's a arguable moral violation, then it's almost not able to be defended by the parents because there's no due process required. And how are you going to say that it wasn't a moral violation? So you have to realize when you attend a private or non-public school, even in the situation where the student is district placed, or where you're paying, in any case, paying private tuition, you're on the scholarship, the school is not required to provide due process. They're also not required to have that hearing in which they make a determination as to whether or not the behavior in question was a manifestation of the child's disability. So that can be a real shocker where you end up expelled and you can't really do anything about it. Now, if they have a handbook that provides for due process and they didn't follow that, then you have what's called, it's really basically a breach of contract. But good luck trying to enforce a breach of contract based on the handbook, which is an implied contract. It would most likely take a lawsuit, which most people don't want to go through for the expulsion, although it does happen. Just a big shocker sometimes when the students end up expelled from a private school. Now let's talk a little bit about the obligations of the private school when they accept students with disabilities. Like I mentioned, they're not bound by IDEA. They are not bound by the state operating standards for children with disabilities in Ohio. They're not bound by public records laws, FERPA, the ADA, or 504. If they accept from federal funding, they can get bound or be bound by the ADA or 504, but that's a tough hill to climb typically. And keep in mind, we talked about FERPA. You're not entitled to a full copy of the child's cumulative education record, including special education records. Now, the schools may provide those, and to their credit, most private schools kind of follow what public schools do because that's what parents are used to, and they would provide education records, but there's nothing you can do if they don't. There's no law that requires them to provide a copy of the education record. In fact, there's no law that requires them not to give it to a third party. So that's what FERPA protects students with for public schools, but that doesn't apply in the case of a private school, even in the case of a private school where the student, the private school is set up to service the student with the disability. Now, will they? Yes, they may. They may provide their records. Most of the schools, like I mentioned, the private schools will create something very similar to an IEP, but they're not bound to follow it. There's typically no law that requires them to follow the IEP. But again, to many schools' credit who service students with disabilities, a lot of these private schools follow them to the T and may even follow them better than the public school, but there's no law that requires them to follow it. It's basically them identifying that they can do something better and doing it. And again, that's sometimes a shock that you'll get a service plan, which is largely like the IEP that was developed from the public school district of residence. And then there are lots of violations about what they provide. Maybe they take the aid away. Maybe the small group instruction has 20 kids in it. But there's not much you can do with the violation. You don't have access to the dispute resolution procedures that you have through ODE with the public school. You don't have a right to a mediator. You don't have a right to file a state complaint. You don't have a right to file due process. You don't have a right to a facilitator. All of those things the private schools are not bound by, and those dispute resolution procedures are not available. Now, keep in mind, though, the traditional public school district retains responsibility for child finding students with disabilities and then evaluating them and creating an IEP, but not for servicing the IEP. If you accept the John Peterson Scholarship or Autism Scholarship, which we'll talk about, you place the student at the private school despite the district making FAPE available to the student. So again, that's not district placed, it's parent placed students at a private school. If the school district's saying, hey, we can service Johnny, and if you take him, voluntarily to a private school and place Johnny in the private school, then they're not required to service the IEP. They will, if one may already be in place, or they may identify, evaluate, and create an IEP. But if the parent places the student at the private school, they're not bound to service the IEP. Now, if the district places the student in the private school, then the district retains obligations for FAPE, and they'll be at the IEP meetings. They'll help develop the IEP, so on and so forth, because they are satisfying their obligation to provide a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment by placing Johnny in the best place, according to the IEP team, which is Johnny's least restrictive environment. So they retain all of those responsibilities under IDEA. I know this is a lot of information fast. Hopefully we can get some questions out towards the end. I added homeschooling on here, although technically homeschooling is an exception to attendance. All the other options we've talked about will satisfy the attendance requirements. You can attend in any of those traditional public schools, private schools, charter schools, or community schools in Ohio, and you satisfy your obligation for attendance. However, you can also request that you be accepted from or removed from the attendance requirement. And all you have to do is notify your school district of residence, the superintendent, agree to provide 900 hours of instruction yourself. You have to notify the superintendent every year, and then provide some assessment or take the school's assessments. And the home education teacher must have a certificate of high school equivalence. So graduate high school, some equivalence, GED, or serve under someone with a bachelor's degree, I think there's some details in there I'm leaving out, but a relatively easy standard to meet. If the requirements are met, the superintendent must release the student from the required compulsory school attendance. So then they're no longer attending. One side note is that they can participate in extracurriculars. If you're a homeschooled student, you can participate in extracurriculars at the school district of residence. That's also true with a community school or a private school. If that community school or private school doesn't offer the same activity, then children attending those schools can participate in extracurriculars at the school district of residence.
Hey, Mark, I was just going to jump in really quick on that note.
Yeah.
And I know you said you're going to talk about scholarships, so I may be jumping in too early. But
That's
I was just
all
going to add that, a parent can certainly use the scholarship program as a homeschooled child to use for related services and services outside of the home.
Yeah, thank you for that too. I was going to ask your opinion. So thanks for jumping in.
Yeah.
Danielle is a homeschool mom to 4 little ones. So she's experienced it firsthand, and I'm sure we'll be able to add some information. As I'm talking about the scholarships, feel free to jump in, but
Okay,
I
perfect.
know those can be used. Thanks, Danielle.
Okay. Yep.
If you ever decide not to homeschool anymore, if you reside in the district still, then you are entitled to return to the district, but it's up to the superintendent to determine the appropriate grade level for the student. And the district retains responsibility to identify students with disabilities and create the IEP for homeschool students. Yeah, so scholarships, we're going to talk about 3. The first 2 are here. The Autism Scholarship is available to any student identified by their district as a child with autism and for whom the district has created an IEP. So allows is what it's supposed to say there, allows parents to send children to a special education program other than the school district of residence and receive services outlined in the IEP. So it's up to $32,000 per year. And so it's either the amount charged by the charged for the child by the special education program, or $32,000 per year, whichever is less. There is a March 31st deadline each year for the autism scholarship, not for the John Peterson scholarship. But so that scholarship, along with the John Peterson scholarship, you'll see at the bottom, if you accept that scholarship, you can use that. Now, it can be used for tuition. This is where the chartered and non-chartered private schools come into play. A chartered private school can accept the autism and John Peterson scholarship dollars to cover part of the education or part of tuition, basically. But the other thing you can use the autism and John Peterson scholarship for, and this is what most people use it for, is services you would receive under the IEP. And so there are service providers, non-chartered, non-public schools. Most of them are service providers under the scholarships. And there are lots of other service providers: speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavior intervention. Help me out, Danielle. Lots of other service providers.
OT, PT, reading instruction.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to add too, for the John Peterson, while speech and language under that category can qualify you for the John Peterson scholarship, you cannot use that for tuition. So speech and language as the disability category is the only one that you cannot use for tuition.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
And John Peterson is for K-12 students who have an IEP from their district, and the amount is based on the primary disability category on the ETR, up to $27,000. So it's a substantial amount of money. Those, at least the autism scholarship was just raised recently. I'm not sure about John Peterson, but it's a substantial amount of money that you can use to either receive services or attend a non-public school, a private school. And I'm going to go back one. Just note again, with both of those, your FAPE is waived. So the school district of residence is no longer required to make FAPE available. Again, what typically happens is you work with the school district of residence to develop, identify the student with a disability, develop the IEP, and that will make you eligible then for the autism scholarship or John Peterson scholarship. And what Danielle was saying earlier is that you can be a homeschooled student. So you're accepted from attendance. And then as long as the school district of residence has placed the student on an IEP and developed it, so drafted it largely, then you can accept the scholarships and use those scholarship funds to, get the education elsewhere, get the services elsewhere, and then not attend the school district of residence. So you can homeschool your child and take both scholarships. That's one way. Or again, you can send your child to a private school and receive services elsewhere or at the private school and accept the scholarship funds and use those to pay for the education. Now, Ed Choice is an evolving concept. It's been around for a while, but the eligibility has been expanded over time. It expanded last year, it expanded the year before, and now it's expanding for next year. So in summary, I guess, Ed Choice was available initially for students who reside in or who would attend a building which was in the lowest 20% of performance of all buildings in the state. So it was a way to give students in low performing districts who would attend a low performing building the availability to funds to let them take their money and go to a private school. So you have to be an Ed Choice approved private school to be able to accept the scholarship. And the scholarship is relatively low. The amount's $5,500 for K-8 and $7,500 for 9 through 12. And or if the tuition is less, it will pay the lesser amount, of course. But now it's expanded. So now, in addition to those students who reside in those low performing districts, students are, you'll see there at the bottom, students who do not meet the traditional criteria if the family household income is at or below 250% of the federal poverty guidelines, or the new student has a sibling that received an Ed Choice expansion scholarship in the preceding year. So if you have a sibling, or if you're 250% below the federal poverty guidelines, you also may be eligible. So you can imagine how much that expands the availability of the scholarship beyond the lowest performing districts. One note too, I'm going to jump back up. So let's say tuition is $10,000 and you have a ninth grader, you would be responsible for the additional $2,500 in that case to pay the tuition at the private school. Except, this is confusing because we just talked about you're eligible if you're at 250% of the federal poverty guidelines. But if you're not responsible for the additional tuition if you're at 200% or less of the federal poverty guidelines. So there's kind of two thresholds, and you'll see if I move to this chart, this is kind of gives you a rough idea of what you can make and still get the Ed Choice scholarship for next school year. Well, the 200% is if you're in a low performing district and you're below the 200% annual amount, then you don't have to pay the additional tuition that the school would traditionally charge you or typically charge you. And you could also qualify for the scholarship if you're at or below 250% at that level. So it gives you an idea. If you have 4 people in the household, then you can make up to $75,000 to be eligible under the income eligibility, or you could reside in a lower performing district and be assigned to a lower performing school. So those funds, I'm going to back up a step here. Those funds are available for you to take to any private school who accepts Ed Choice. And again, you may be responsible for the additional tuition. It's important, though, that we're talking about private schools. This is always a shocker, both with Ed Choice and with the Autism Scholarship and John Peterson Scholarship. You're taking your money elsewhere from a public school to a private school. So all of those protections we talked about that apply to public schools do not apply to private schools, even if they're a private school that serves a student with a disability. So they're not bound by IDEA. That's a surprise because you're taking the John Peterson or Autism Scholarship and giving it to a service provider or a private school. They're not bound by the same rules that public school districts are bound by. They will, in a lot of cases, service the IEP or give you a service plan, but you don't have the same protections to challenge a failure on their part that you would if you were attending a public school. And the same thing with Ed Choice. Now, I would hope over time that all 3 scholarships evolve to make some of these private schools more accountable for the special education students that they're enrolling. But as of right now, there are very limited, almost no requirements for Ed Choice scholarship schools or autism or JPS schools to fulfill the obligations on an IEP. So it is tough. Sometimes it's a little bit of trial and error. You attend a school that you think will be better, you do, and maybe it's not. The obligations largely fall on the public schools. So we're talking about the traditional public schools and community schools in Ohio. So that was a really quick flyby of school choice. And I see one question popped up. Let's see if I can answer that. Does taking these scholarships change diploma options? No, I don't think it changes the options. Now, the scholarships are available through graduation. So if the student graduates, then the scholarship will no longer be available. And this comes up a lot right about this time for graduation. It's still going to be an IEP team decision as to whether or not the student should graduate or continue until they're age 22 in whichever setting they're in. So I can't think of anything in particular that would change the diploma options. Now, there are lots of options in regards to certificates and workforce development. And, but I don't think trying to think. If you're attending a non-public school, yeah, you would, if you're attending a non-public school, you would receive a diploma through that school. If you're, if you fulfill the obligations on the IEP and the IEP team decides that you should graduate, then you would graduate in that regard, unless I'm missing something. Danielle or
Yeah,
Renee,
I
you
was
have
gonna
anything to add?
say, you just need to make sure that that private provider is certified to give a diploma, because some are not. Some only are certified to have those requirements through grade 8. And so if they're not certified 9 through 12, then your child would not get a diploma and going to that non-public school.
Yeah, and that's a good point that I guess I didn't consider. If you're not attending a non-public school and you're just using the autism or JPS funds to get services on the IEP, then you're right. A lot of those service providers who are not non-public schools are not going to be, they don't have the authority to grant a diploma. You have to
Well,
be.
even some schools, I'm trying to think, I think News Story has changed, but not too long ago, News Story, which used to be Hogland, they were not certified to get diplomas. So if you had a high schooler who was attending that program, they would not graduate with a diploma.
Right. So that's where the chartered and non-chartered comes out. So
Yeah,
I think for a while, there were some schools who were chartered in, let's say, K through 8, but they allowed their students to continue, and technically they were just a service provider for high school.
makes
And in that
sense.
case, they didn't have the authority to issue a diploma that was at least recognized by the Department of Education. So that, yeah, that can happen. And if you're just using service providers as opposed to a non-public school with the scholarships, absolutely, you want to consider whether or not that service provider has the authority to grant a diploma. And let's see. Okay. That is really the end of the presentation. I would encourage everyone to sign up for the next workshop. Next month is dispute resolution through the Department of Education. And the link is there at the bottom, lawyersforstudents.com/legal clinic. I'll stay for a couple more minutes to see if there are questions. If that was a whirlwind of information. So I'm sorry if I didn't stop talking for a while, but we can take a pause. If there are any questions, we'd be glad to try to answer those.
I've got to jump off. I've got to make a quick phone call, but if anyone has any questions, certainly reach out to any of us on the panel today, and we would be happy to answer your questions.
Thanks, Danielle.
Thank you.
All right, well, it looks like it's quiet. So, and you can always email either me or Renee. It's mark@awlawohio.com and Renee at awlawohio.com. I'm not sure why my brain's not working. awlawohio.com.
You got it all though.
And I think it's at the bottom of that registration page if you need it too. All right. Well, thanks for jumping on today, Renee, and everyone else. And we hope to see you next month.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.